Okay, everyone, we are just about to get started here in a few minutes. If you will, please go ahead and type any questions that you have from last week in the comment box. And also, please go ahead and submit your name in the comment box as well so that I can get you marked down for having attended today. And we'll get started here at about 2:03. So thank you very much, and I'll talk to you guys in a minute. All right, it looks like we are ready to get started. So just to kind of start off like we usually do and kind of let you guys know where we're at, this is the start of week 6. We're going to cover chapter 13 today and chapter 14 on Thursday. Your exam review for exam 3 is already posted in that week 6 folder. So definitely take a look at that before you do begin that exam. And exam 3 will be due on Monday at 11:59 along with your chapter 13 inquisitive. And remember, as long as you get that chapter 13 inquisitive finished up, I will go ahead and give you that participation grade on the chapter 14. So we'll go ahead and kind of hit the ground running with that. And just to kind of give you a little more of a reminder, we'll have today's lecture and Thursday's lecture. And then in week 7, we'll lecture on Tuesday and Thursday. And week 8 is just your final exam. So after today, we only have 3 more lectures left. So you guys are all doing really great. Hang in there. There's not a ton of time left in this semester, but you guys are doing a great job, and you just need to kind of finish strong. Let's go ahead and get into our PowerPoint for this chapter. So chapter 13 covers the aggregate demand and the aggregate supply model. This is a really good chapter. A lot of students tend to enjoy this chapter because it's really just supply and demand on a larger level. So we've done a lot with supply and demand this semester. You guys have looked at it in basic supply and demand models. You've looked at it in the loanable funds market with supply and demand. We've kind of assessed this supply and demand concept quite a few times throughout the semester. So aggregate demand and aggregate supply, this kind of is a culmination of a lot of the things that we've been talking about. And a lot of students find this chapter to be a lot easier compared to some of the other chapters because you've really already seen a lot of these concepts already earlier in the semester. So last week we talked about chapter 12 and we talked about the solo model. We talked about how this was kind of the original model for measuring economic growth, and it really focused mainly on capital investment. So in this original model, we thought that if we just threw capital at nations that weren't developing quickly, that they would be successful and that would kind of bring them up to par. But then we started to kind of see that that wasn't something that was all there was to it. Now, modern growth theory, this is what we use now, this recognizes that institutions are also very essential for growth. So remember, institutions are things like the government, laws, the enforcement of laws, private property rights, anything along that line. And we talked about how it's so important to have those institutions in order to foster growth within a nation. We also talked about how modern growth theory treats technological advancements as endogenous. So remember, exogenous was what we used to think technology advancements were. So that would mean that they were just random, kind of like strikes of lightning. But with the modern growth theory, we started to realize that these advancements were really endogenous, or coming from within the nations that were having success. And basically that innovation sort of fosters innovation. So just a little recap of last week, and we'll go ahead and move right into this chapter. Now, our big questions, the things that I want you to be thinking about as we go throughout this chapter and the things that we'll cover in this chapter, we're going to talk about what is the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. And in economics, remember, aggregate is that total or sum. We're going to specifically say what is aggregate demand, then what is aggregate supply, and then we're going to ask ourselves, how does this aggregate demand, aggregate supply model help us understand the economy? So here's another question for you. What factors are going to influence the price level and the amount of output in the entire economy? So think about all the things that we've talked about this semester, and what do you think influences the price level or how much companies are making? What do you think sets prices, or how do they come up with prices, and how do they come up with how much they should produce? And you can go ahead and type some answers in the comment box about this one, and we'll kind of loop back around to those here in just a little bit. But, you know, ask yourself where those come from, and then kind of give a couple of examples if you can think of any. Now, this is a little bit of review as well. We're just kind of, you know, circling back and talking about in macroeconomics what it is. So we have two major paths of study when we're pursuing macroeconomics. One of those is going to be exploring long-run growth and development, and the other is going to be exploring the short-run fluctuations in the business cycle. And kind of recall that business cycle is going to be kind of the shorter-term periods. And whenever we look at real GDP growth and unemployment, we're looking at what's happening at different parts in that business cycle. Now, these two paths of study, they're both complementary. We obviously need one to kind of get information for the other, but they really differ in the length of time that we're focusing on. So if we're just focusing on long-run growth, we're generally looking at periods of 5 to 10 plus years. And if we're focusing on the short-run fluctuations, so the business cycle side, this is when we're generally focusing on periods of less than 5 years. So the phases of the business cycle, we've kind of talked about those a lot in chapter 6. But remember that real GDP and unemployment are going to fluctuate over the business cycle, and we're really more concerned in those long-term trends. So Eric said consumption and costs, and that's a great answer to that previous slide's question. The way that we set the price level and the way that we determine as business owners how much to price things is based off of, you know, what it costs us to make it, historically how many of this product have sold, and a bunch of other estimations. So great answer. Thank you, Eric. Now, this is figure 13.1 from your book, and what this is showing us is quarterly real GDP growth has declined during some of the shaded periods, and this would kind of indicate recession. So this graph, in one way or another, if you've been on these live streams every time, which most of you that are here today have, it's not new news that the shaded areas are recessions. This graph is just kind of specifically demonstrating those based off of that real GDP growth rate and also unemployment. Now, real GDP growth is also going to increase during those non-recessionary periods. And we'll kind of like pick this graph apart more throughout this chapter, but this should be something that feels very familiar to you, as we've seen this quite a few times this semester. Now, this is also from figure 13.1, and this diagram is showing that our unemployment rate is going to spike up during each of our 3 recessions. So you can see here, unemployment rose during this recession, unemployment rose during this recession, and then the most recent until, obviously today, unemployment also significantly rose during this recession. So it would be, pretty safe to assume that the period from 2020 into, whenever this whole thing calms down will look very similar to this sort of 2008 to 2010 area. This is something that we're going to see. We're going to see unemployment going up. We're going to see, like in this previous slide, that our real GDP growth rate will likely go down. And then we'll be able to kind of make some, horizontal comparisons and say that what's going on now will be somewhat similar to what's happened in the past. Although the reason that economists are going to have a little bit more trouble kind of classifying and identifying or predicting how long our current state of the economy will last is because this is more of a recession that was made by design rather than by accident, meaning that things were shut down purposefully. We kind of knew this was going to happen, but we don't really know how we'll rebound from that. So just to kind of add a little tidbit and make it a little bit more relevant, something to think about there. Now, definitions of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Aggregate demand is the total demand for final goods and services in the entire economy, and aggregate supply is going to be the total supply of those final goods and services in our entire economy. This is just another supply and demand model. It's really similar to that basic model, as I've said before. The only differences are that we're aggregating. So instead of getting the price and quantity of one particular good, we're looking at the supply and demand for all of the goods in our economy. So again, aggregate is just saying total. We're not going to be looking at a single price, but at the price level. So this will be on the vertical axis, just like price was in our original model. It's the average price level in the economy measured by that GDP deflator. We talked about that a lot in chapter 6, but basically instead of having specific prices of goods, you're going to have kind of that average price level of that basket of goods like we talked about before. Another thing is that overall output or quantity is going to be real GDP or Y. We've seen it labeled as Y in a lot of these formulas. And remember, that came from chapter 6 as well. So we are going to go over all of these formulas again today. But the purpose of this class is to prepare you to be able to plug in and kind of interpret what you're looking at. So I don't expect that you have all of this stuff memorized. If this doesn't immediately sound very familiar to you, I promise it will the further that we get into it. I just want you to be able to look at what we're doing, look at your slides, and then be able to make educated decisions based on the information given in your slides. So the aggregate demand formula, let me go ahead and pop this whole slide up so you can see what's going on here. This is a review equation from chapter 6. So to determine our aggregate demand, we're going to sum up spending from different sources in the economy. C in this formula is going to be consumption. So these sources where we get the consumption information from are going to include private domestic consumers that are buying things like cars, food, clothing, education, and tons of other goods and services. We're really adding up every single final good that's available. I, in this case, is investment. We talked about that before. We know that business firms are another major group of this kind of equation, and they're going to buy resources that they need to go ahead and produce output. So this can be things like machinery, any of that big spending that goes directly back into the business to generate additional capital. G in the formula is government spending. So the government also is a very large purchaser of other labor and resources. And then NX is net exports. So this aggregate demand formula, as Eric is pointing out here, looks very familiar, and it's GDP. That's what aggregate demand is. So that's very good that you're making that connection. And this is one reason why these introductory macroeconomics classes, at the beginning, people are typically very nervous about these, but towards the end, they start to feel like it wasn't as nearly as bad of a class as they thought it would be in terms of difficulty. And that's because a lot of these equations we derive from the same places. So yes, very good. Our aggregate demand formula is very similar to the GDP formula in the sense that it is GDP. So great job. Now graphically, this is figure 13.2 from your book, but we're going to just kind of click through to look at a bit of an example here. So the first click here is going to show you that our real GDP, which is this x-axis or the horizontal axis, was 16 trillions of dollars. Now, the price level for our base year here was 100. Remember, price level at your base year should always be 100. Any change from our base year is going to indicate inflation or deflation. So this should also look very familiar. And this is showing us the aggregate demand curve for our economy. We already know we've kind of identified our vertical axis as our price level, our horizontal axis is our real GDP. Now, the demand curve has a negative slope. I hope that you all remember that. And the reason why this demand curve has a negative slope is because an increase in the price level is going to lower that aggregate demand. So if the price level goes up, demand will go down. If that price level goes down, demand will go up. That's just kind of simple supply and demand that we've talked about. And we'll kind of click through, I guess it won't show, but basically if the price level rose from 100 to 105, our real GDP would fall from 16 down to 15.5. Now, if the price level were to fall to 95, our real GDP or our aggregate demand would increase to 16.5. So this should look very familiar. I'm so glad that Eric made that connection, but supply side will be the exact same way. Now, the negative relationship between the quantity of aggregate demand and the price level is because of three different things. One is the wealth effect, two is the interest rate effect, and three is the international trade effect. Each of these effects is covered in their own slide, so we'll go ahead and move on. So the wealth effect, wealth is our value of the individual's accumulated access. So the bathtub example, remember that whenever we talk about wealth, that's what's left in the bathtub. If we have our normal bathtub, the drain is open and the shower head is on, what's coming out of the shower head is the money that you're making. What's going out of the bathtub through the drain is the money that you're spending on consumption. And the water that is retained in the bathtub, that's what wealth is. It's the value of the household's accumulated assets that are still in that bathtub. Now, the wealth effect, this is the change in the quantity of aggregate demand that happens because of wealth changes that were due to price level changes. So some examples of wealth outside of our bathtub example, things that are considered wealth are going to be currency, stocks, bonds, artwork, real estate, bank accounts, anything in that kind of realm. If the price level rises, the purchasing power of your wealth is going to fall. And what that basically means is that people are unable to buy as much, so their overall quantity of aggregate demand is going to fall. Now, if deflation occurs and the price level falls, the purchasing power of the wealth that you have in your possession now rises, and you're in turn able to buy more. So the quantity of aggregate or total demand is going to increase because now the wealth that we currently have has a higher purchasing power. Now remember, wealth and income are different. So income would just be that water that was coming out of the faucet that you're making at your job. Wealth is what you're retaining after all of your consumption. So any of your assets that you have on your person that you're not consuming. Now the interest rate effect, this is a second thing that affects aggregate demand. And this is going to occur when a change in the price level leads to a change in interest rates, and then in turn changes in the quantity of aggregate demand. So we know that there is an opportunity cost of borrowing, and that opportunity cost is the interest that you pay whenever you take out a loan or borrow. Higher interest rates are going to make loans more expensive and in turn decrease economic activity in sectors that are really interest rate sensitive. So as the price level rises, the ability to save is going to fall. And when the ability to save falls, less people are supplying those loanable funds, because remember, that loanable funds market comes directly from people saving their money. Now, interest rates are going to rise as that supply of loanable funds falls, and purchases of goods on credit are going to decline as well. So this is mainly a drop in investment, but some large ticket consumer goods will have drops in purchases as well. So again, if the price level goes up, less people save, interest rates go up, and in turn, less people will borrow, because we don't want to borrow if the interest rate's high. Now, if the price level falls, more people are able to save, so there's more loanable funds available, interest rates will go down, and more people will buy things on credit. So mainly this will be investment, but some people will borrow with credit to get large ticket consumer goods. But essentially, if the price level goes up, the interest rates will go up, borrowing goes down. If the price level goes down, interest rates also go down and borrowing will increase. So very good, Eric, kind of typing that formula in there for wealth. Thank you for that. Now, just to kind of show you what this interest rate effect looks like graphically, this is figure 13.3, and remember, you've seen this before. The loanable funds market is really just another market with supply and demand. The demand for loanable funds is this blue line right here that has a downward slope, and then these orange lines are showing us the supply of loanable funds. Now, in this diagram, an increase in the price level, so the price level went up and interest rates went up, caused the supply of loanable funds to jump to the left. It was a change in something that happened right here. And then because of that change, less people are going to borrow. So we've seen this before, and it's basically just telling us that investment purchases are going to be postponed or scrapped altogether. So this should all feel very, very familiar. Now, the international trade effect, this is going to occur when there's a change in the price level that leads to a change in the quantity of net exports that are demanded. So considering the domestic US market, that's what we're looking at here. Changes in the US price level means that US goods prices are going to change relative to the prices of goods from other nations. This is going to affect both what we're importing and what we're exporting. So suppose that the US price level increases, assume that all other countries' price levels are remaining the same. So the only thing that's changing here is that the US price level is increasing. The prices of US made goods are now considered to be relatively more expensive. And because of this, exports will fall. So why are exports falling? Well, if our goods are more expensive in comparison to other countries, less other countries are going to be buying our goods. So both affects the price of foreign goods now. If US prices rise and our goods are now relatively more expensive compared to other countries, foreign goods are now considered relatively cheaper. And that means that imports will rise because we're going to be importing more things to get them cheaper. Now, both effects are going to mean that the net exports are going to fall because we know that net exports are exports minus imports. And if exports are going down and imports are going up, that net export number is going to get even smaller. So the slope of the aggregate demand curve, this is figure 13.4 from your textbook. At a price level of 100, so that's our base level, the quantity of aggregate demand is 16 trillion. We've seen this already. Real GDP on the x-axis, price level on the y-axis. Now, when the price level rises from 100 to 110, the quantity of aggregate demand here, or real GDP, is going to fall from 16 trillion back to 15 trillion. What we're looking at on this line here, there's a negative relationship that's due to the three different effects that we just talked about. So the wealth effect implies that a lower quantity of consumption demand because the real wealth or the purchasing power of that wealth is falling at higher price levels. So that's this C right here. Consumption is decreasing. Now the interest rate effect, the second effect that we talked about, implies a lower quantity of investment demand because of the higher interest rates. So remember, less people are saving, interest rates go up, and less people are borrowing. So that's this middle piece, which is another chunk of why that aggregate demand is decreasing. And then the international trade effect that we just talked about is this last little piece of this, that there's going to be lower quantity of net exports due to the relatively higher domestic prices. So each effect is going to be a different component of why this aggregate demand is decreasing, but all that you need to know is that the decrease is occurring because of those three things. It's not just one thing, it's kind of a chain reaction of a bunch of different things happening. So movements along the aggregate demand curve versus shifts in the aggregate demand curve. Of course, this also should be a review, but it's still good to kind of, talk about it and talk about that ceteris paribus assumption. So movements along the curve, these are going to be changes in the price level. This is going to affect the quantity of aggregate demand through the three effects. So the wealth effect, the interest rate effect, and that international trade effect. Shifts of the curve are going to happen whenever something other than the price level changes. So much like regular supply and demand, whenever we draw this aggregate demand curve, we're assuming that the only things that are changing are the price level and the quantity of aggregate demand. So this should feel very familiar. This is something we've seen multiple times this semester. It's just being applied in a slightly different way. Now, to determine what is causing shifts of the aggregate demand curve, so rather than movement along the curve, the actual shifting of the curve, we have to kind of understand the formula. This is the same formula we've already seen a bunch of times, but we have to look at all the different types of spending. And we'll talk about kind of shifts in each of those and what that means in the coming slides. So a shift in consumption, let's go ahead and pop up this whole slide for you. And this is because of changes in real wealth. So number one here is the stock market rises or falls, or there's a widespread change in real estate values. So if the stock market rises, people are going to feel wealthier. They're looking at their accounts and things look good. So they're going to go out and they're going to buy more goods. Consumption is going to rise and aggregate demand is going to rise as well. Now, on the other hand, same thing. If the stock market falls significantly, people start to feel a little poorer. They start to worry. They're not going to buy as many goods. Consumption decreases. Aggregate demand falls. Now, number two on this slide, general expectations about the future. We've talked about this significantly in depth this semester, those animal spirits and kind of the feelings that we have about what's going on. If there are changes in our expected income or changes in our consumer confidence, this starts to cause people to worry about the future. So if you're worried about the future, you're going to do your best to increase your savings. You're going to buy fewer goods, consumption falls, and aggregate demand falls as well. Again, on the other side of that coin, if you start to feel very good about the future, if you think that good things are coming, you're going to save less, spend more, consumption rises, aggregate demand increases. So these are shifts to the right or the left. Now, the last thing on this slide, if there's changes in taxes, for example, if taxes increase, your after-tax income is going to fall. You won't be able to purchase as much, your consumption falls, aggregate demand falls. So these are all kind of just examples you can use as you're working through these. The next thing is changes, shifts in investment. So let me go ahead and get this all up and ready for you. Now, investor confidence is very important. Firms really have to consider the future for any investment project. If you're gonna, invest in a large project as a business owner, you really have to kind of ask yourself, what is the long-term nature of the benefits from this investment? Am I really going to get my money's worth from doing this? Is this going to be a smart investment? And then you have to kind of ask yourself, for example, if you're trying to build a new factory, is this factory going to cost me more than it's going to make me? And these are really questions that all businesses are asking. And what they expect to happen, what their expectations are, this is really going to impact the likelihood of whether they go through with these investments or not. Now, interest rates, remember that the change in the interest rate has to be caused by something other than a change in the price level. So that would be specifically if it caused a shift, something had to have changed the interest rates that was not related to the price level at all. And then the quantity of money, so just kind of briefly here, the more money that we have produced is going to reduce interest rates. The more money that we have in the loanable funds market is going to reduce interest rates. We will have this kind of discussed in more detail in Chapter 18, but that's just something to kind of start thinking about now. So moving on, shifts in government spending are also going to cause shifts of that aggregate demand curve. So government spending is the component of aggregate demand that economic theory has really the least to say about. And that's because this is really influenced by government policy. This may or may not be economic driven. It can be policy that has to do with completely outside of the realm of economics. So sometimes the government creates policies to counteract current economic issues. This is also discussed in further detail in Chapter 16, but that can also be equated to what's happening right now. So for example, the CARES Act that provided a lot of Americans with stimulus checks, this was an example of a government policy that was enacted to counteract what was going on with the COVID pandemic. So we'll talk about kind of these government policies in a lot more detail in Chapter 16, but policy changes and changes in government spending are going to shift that aggregate demand curve. Whether it's the way that they were hoping to, that's a different story, but we will talk about that more a little later this semester. Now, shifts in international trade, this can be because of the income of individuals in other countries or because of exchange rates. So foreign income is a big deal. If foreign nations become wealthier, the demand for U.S. goods will increase. Net exports will increase and aggregate demand will increase. If a foreign nation goes into a recession, the demand for U.S. goods is going to decrease. Net exports will also decrease and aggregate demand will fall. Now, exchange rates, understand that this is a change in the exchange rates that's not caused by the U.S. price level. So if the value of the U.S. dollar rises in comparison to other countries, the United States can buy more imports and other states or other countries, can buy less U.S. goods. So this would decrease our exports and increase our imports, and aggregate demand would fall. Now, if the value of our U.S. dollar falls, the U.S. cannot afford as many imports. Other countries are going to be buying more U.S. goods, which is going to increase our exports. Net exports is going to rise, and aggregate demand is going to increase. So figure 13.5 in your textbook gives you a really great summary of all of the things that shift aggregate demand. So definitely make sure to kind of take a look at that when you're working on that exam review and kind of preparing to do your inquisitive and your exam for your third exam. So here's a practice what you know. The wealth effect can help explain what? Taylor says B, and that is correct. So the wealth effect can help explain the negative slope of the aggregate demand curve. Wonderful, good answer, thank you. Here's another practice what you know. Consider just the aggregate demand curve that we've been looking at. Suppose that consumption broadly increases. What will this cause? So Eric, you're close, but it's not A on this one. I'll give you a second to think about why it's not A. Remember, movement along the curve is just related to changes in the price level. So consumption isn't a change in the price level in this case. That is correct. It is B. So the reason that the answer to this one is B is if it had said, suppose that the price level goes down and consumption broadly increases, this would cause a movement along the curve. But because just consumption is broadly increasing, it could be because of the wealth effect, it could be for any number of reasons, but it will be an actual shift where that curve will jump outward or to the right, rather than just a movement along the curve, because that would just be because of changes in the price level. So very good, and thank you for kind of working through that again. So the function of the firm, this is figure 13.6, and this is kind of to help you get into the mindset of the producer. So we're really used to kind of putting ourselves in the consumer shoes because we're all consumers every day. But the producer side, that's something that a lot of students struggle with, getting into that mindset. So the basic function of a firm, in this case, the firm is this little coffee shop, is to convert inputs, so labor, capital, raw materials, into outputs, which are goods and services, or in this case, coffee. Remember that the input prices, so what it costs the firm to make the good, are going to determine the output prices. So there's other things that go into it, but setting that output price is going to determine what our revenues are going to be. So looking at this from the other side, or from that firm side, we're going to start talking about aggregate supply now. This is just like regular supply and demand were before. It's just looking at the other side of that coin. So we want to know, when we draw the aggregate supply curve, we want to hold everything constant except the price level and the quantity of aggregate supply, just like how we were holding everything constant on the demand side. So we want to know what happens to the quantity of the aggregate supply as the price level is changing. And this really depends on our time horizon. So we have the long run and we have the short run. And remember, the long run is a period of time that's sufficient for all prices to adjust. And the short run is the period of time in which some prices have not yet adjusted. And remember that looking at these different kind of time periods are going to give us very different answers. So long run aggregate supply, we have two identical economies, A and B, and A has twice as much money as B. In the long term, with the same amount of labor, capital, resources, and technology in A and B, we want to find out why goods are twice as expensive in A. So the implication here, the question is, why do we have different price levels at the same output? And then we're going to kind of talk about these things as we go on a little bit throughout this the remainder of this chapter. So remember, in the long run, the economy is going to move towards full employment output, which is Y prime. That's when unemployment is at its natural rate, where there's no bad kinds of unemployment occurring. And the natural rate of unemployment basically has all the businesses matched with the job seekers' needs. So let's go ahead and look at this a little more. So the long run aggregate supply curve is always just going to be this vertical line. You can see here they have it abbreviated as LRAS for long run aggregate supply. We have real GDP on the x-axis and price level on the y-axis. And Y prime is that kind of right here, this full employment is Y prime. U prime with the little asterisk over here is that natural rate of unemployment. So on this long run aggregate supply curve, unemployment is equal to that natural rate of unemployment. And we're kind of at our best possible level for the economy. So as the price level changes, the long run quantity of aggregate supply is not going to change. It will always stay at this vertical line. So regardless of what this price level is, this is always what your long run aggregate supply curve will look like. Now shifts in long run aggregate supply, that would be if that line jumped over to the right or over to the left. So remember, as far as movement along the long run aggregate supply curve goes, it doesn't matter. It's always going to be the same. Real GDP won't change because that quantity of aggregate supply won't change in the long term. Things that can shift that long run aggregate supply are going to be changes in resources, changes in technology, and changes in institutions. So examples of changes in resources, this would be more or less resources. So it could be growth in the labor force, early retirement in the labor force, newly discovered natural resources, better resources, any of these things. Now, changes in technology, this could be growth of the internet, growth in telecommunications, robotics, growth of any kind of thing that expands our technology capabilities. And then examples of institutional changes could be things like changes in our tax rates. So these changes would affect the after-tax return on investments or government research into new technologies. So these are all things that could make that long-run aggregate supply vertical line jump to the right or jump to the left. So this is figure 13.8 from your book. And we have our long-run aggregate supply curve that's at the full employment output, which is Y prime. The first click here is going to show an increase. So a jump to the right is an increase in long-run aggregate supply. And this means that we're now able to produce more than we were before at full employment. So Y prime prime is greater than our original Y prime here. This is a long-run aggregate supply shift to the right. So it's an increase in that long-run aggregate supply. Now a decrease in long-run aggregate supply from 1 to 3 here. This means that we're now able to produce less at full employment. In this case, our Y with 3 primes is less than our original Y prime, and our long-run aggregate supply is shifting completely to the left. So these are changes in anything other than the price level that are causing that entire curve to either jump to the right or jump to the left. And this is just showing you kind of the changes that are happening with unemployment as well. So why is that long-run aggregate supply curve vertical? And this one is a little tricky, so don't feel bad if you don't get it right off the bat. Wonderful. The correct answer for this question is C. Prices have nothing to do with long-term output. And the reason being, that was very briefly inserted in the earlier slides, was that in the long term, prices have a chance to adjust. So in the long term, prices really aren't going to have anything to do with long-run output or aggregate supply. And that's why we don't have to worry about that curve, not being a straight line. So there are 3 reasons why there's going to be a positive relationship between the price level and the quantity of aggregate supply in the short run. And that's because of sticky input prices, money or menu costs, and the money illusion. So we're going to explain these in depth in the next 3 slides, but there's kind of a common thread that each of these theories shares, and that's that when the price level deviates from kind of what society is expecting, there's going to be real effects on output in the short run. So this is the short run aggregate supply curve here. There's a positive slope, just like with the regular supply curve, because as the price level increases, the quantity supplied is going to increase as well because we're able to get more than we were before. So this is showing you 3 different price levels. 100 is our base as usual. And if the price level increases, the short run aggregate supply will increase. If the price level decreases, the short run aggregate supply is going to decrease as well. And that's because if people are willing to pay more, we want to sell more. And if people are willing to pay less, we don't want to sell as much. We're not getting as much bang for our buck from the producer side. So sticky input prices, this is kind of an interesting one here. Resource prices tend to be sticky, and what that means is they're not nearly as flexible as some other items. So output prices, these are more flexible and easier to change. Output prices can be changed a lot easier. They're more flexible, and not all prices are going to adjust at the same time. So a change in the aggregate price level, which is our output prices, are going to affect a firm's revenues, even though their cost stays the same. And what that means is, if the average price level goes up, revenues can go up as well, but costs have stayed the same. If the average price level or total price level goes down, now output prices or selling prices have gone down, but a firm's costs have not gone down, so their revenue has decreased as well. Now, menu costs, this is kind of exactly what it sounds like. It's sort of named because of what happens whenever the price level rises. If the price level rises, but a firm doesn't want to change their output price because of menu costs, think about what that could mean. Well, what it means is the cost of literally reprinting your entire menu or literally rebranding your entire store. So if a firm doesn't change its output price, even though the price level increases, buying from this firm is now relatively cheaper. Consumers will want to buy more from that particular firm, and the quantity of aggregate supply will have to increase to satisfy that increased consumer want. So in the short run, the quantity of aggregate supply will rise. Now, if the price level falls, but again, the firm doesn't want to change their output price because of menu costs, buying from that firm is now going to feel relatively more expensive. Consumers are going to want to buy less, and in the short run, the quantity of aggregate supply will fall because fewer people want to buy the product. Money illusion, we've talked about this before, but now we're looking at it from the supplier side. This, remember, occurs when people interpret nominal changes in wages or prices as real changes. So think about this scenario. If the price level inflation is 10% and your wage goes up by just 5%, you get the raise and you're kind of tempted to view that as a real raise, but it's really only a nominal raise, remember? Because the inflation's gone up 10%, your wages only went up 5%, you're actually able to buy less than what you were before your raise. So in real terms, which remember, we always care about the real terms, your wage falls in this example because you're not going to be able to buy the same quantity of real goods and services because your wage rose by less than the price level. Now, if the price level falls, workers don't want to accept a nominal wage cut, even if it's less than the level of deflation. So think about that. Just because deflation occurs and the price level decreases, there's not a lot of firms that are able to go to their employees and say, okay, here's the economic data, the price level has fallen, will you go ahead and take a 5% wage cut? That never goes over well, right? Would you guys be willing to take a price cut in your wages because there was a drop in the price level? Most people would say no. So firms are going to see revenues fall because of the reduced output prices, or the reduced prices that consumers are paying, because their costs are not able to go down as well. And because of this, they're going to reduce their output, and the quantity of aggregate supply will fall as well. So things that shift that short-run aggregate supply curve, whenever the long-run aggregate supply curve shifts, it's going to take the short-run curve with it. So we need to look at things that are only going to focus the short-run aggregate supply curve. So things that are only going to shift that particular curve. This is going to be things like changes in resource prices, changes in expectations, and supply shocks, which we're going to cover at the end here in just a second. So again, it's really important to remember the short-run aggregate supply curve will always shift whenever the long-run aggregate supply curve does. They're married to each other. They're committed, they're going to shift at the same time if the long-run supply curve shifts. But the short-run aggregate supply curve can shift by itself without affecting the long-run aggregate supply curve. So usually this would be due to a change in the cost of producing the good, and most often this is going to be a change in their resource prices. So if, wages, gasoline, electricity, raw materials, if the prices of any of these things change, that's things that will shift the short-run aggregate supply curve, but not the long run. Now, expected future price levels, these also affect just the short-run aggregate supply curve. If workers and firms expect higher prices tomorrow, they're going to negotiate those expectations in today's contracts. So costs are higher, and the short-run aggregate supply curve would shift to the left. However, it will not affect long-run production possibilities, so long-run aggregate supply won't move. Now, supply shocks, this is kind of a new thing, but an example of a supply shock would be something like a freeze on crops or a jump or a drop in the price of oil. So supply shocks are any time that unexpectedly, something we didn't see coming, the supply is suddenly significantly changed. A good example of that, to use kind of current things that are going on, are these massive supply shocks that are happening in different industries. So for example, with crops, now that things have changed that are not related to the price level, just related to businesses being closed and limits on groceries and things like that, a lot of dairy farms have a lot more milk than they ever would have expected to have, and they're actually pouring it out. And the same is happening with certain, farm animals being put down and things like that, because there's just not, they have more than what they expected to have. So supply shocks can be positive or negative, but when reading about just a supply shock by itself, it means that it's negative. So this is figure 13.11 from your book, and we're going to kind of look at different things that are causing these shifts. So an increase in short-run aggregate supply shifts to the right. That means that we have more short-run aggregate supply than we did originally. This would be an example of a positive supply shock happening. So the quantity of aggregate supply is greater at all price levels. A decrease in the short-run aggregate supply could be an example of a negative supply shock happening. So a field freezes unexpectedly, we lose a lot of crops, things like that. and that's going to cause that aggregate supply to shift significantly to the left. Now, long-run equilibrium in the economy, this should also look pretty familiar. We know that long-run equilibrium is when all of our lines kind of cross each other and meet up right in the middle. Now, an equilibrium does occur when there's no natural tendency for anything to change, but it's easiest to kind of see this with this diagram. So the long-run equilibrium point is when everything, all the stars align, and we're at our optimal best case scenarios for everything to really just kind of even out. So we start at this equilibrium point, and the quantity of aggregate demand is equal to the quantity of aggregate supply, both long and short run. And the economy's output is at that y prime, that desirable number. Now, with a click here, you can see that we have PL right here. This would be when the price level has gone down. The quantity of aggregate demand over here at this price level is going to be higher than the quantity of aggregate supply at this price level. So if you look at this line right here, this is where the short run aggregate supply would be at this price level. This is where long run aggregate supply is at this price level, and this is where demand is. You can see that demand is higher than what is supplied. Now at pH, this is saying that our price level increased. We have a higher price level. The aggregate supply, both short and long run, is going to be bigger than the demand. So keep that in mind. It's just like regular supply and demand. It just looks a little bit different. And if you were to just kind of come across this graph on accident without having any background, it is a little overwhelming. But if you just work it piece by piece, it's a lot easier to kind of understand what's going on. So remember what's on the vertical axis and what is on the horizontal axis. And the reason being, because now we haven't practiced what you know. So with the aggregate demand and aggregate supply graph, what variable is on the vertical axis? Very good, very good. The correct answer is D, the price level. So that one is really just in there to make me feel better and let me know that you guys are listening. So thank you so much for listening to me. I do appreciate it. Now, the really important question that we have to answer in anything that we cover, really in any class, not just in economics, is why do we need this model? What is it for? What is the purpose? Well, the way that we're able to use this model is to be able to determine how the economy moves from one long-run equilibrium to another. So basically, we can say the following for determining this. We start with our graph in long-run equilibrium. We graph any changes that happen. We find a new equilibrium, and then we examine our graph that we just drew. It'll look just like the graph that we saw a couple slides back, but basically we're not memorizing up and downs. We're just kind of drawing a graph and then analyzing what happened with that graph. We want to know, why is short-run aggregate supply increasing or decreasing? Why has aggregate demand increased or decreased? What is causing these changes? Is it changes in the price level? Is it changes in something else, like the wealth effect, the money illusion, any of these things that we covered? But basically, we literally just start with the one long-run aggregate supply equilibrium and have that kind of magic point, and then we work our way forward and say, what's changed? Why has it changed? Now, adjustments to shifts in long-run aggregate supply. Suppose we have a technology shock. I popped that one a little bit early, so I'll give you guys this answer. Which curves will shift? Long-run aggregate supply and short-run aggregate supply will shift if we have a technology shock. Now, what direction will these shift? And a technology shock, in this case, will shift them to the right. It'll increase them. We had a surprising amount of new technology. And then what will happen to price level and equilibrium? Price level will go down. New technology will make it less expensive to produce. And real GDP will rise. So that's kind of what's going on here. And we're going to look at this graphically. So take a moment. If you have your slides out with you, keep this one so we can talk about the graph as we kind of work through this. If you don't have the slides with you, take a picture of this slide on your phone so that you have kind of the who's who of what's going on, and we're going to look at what this looks like graphically. So this is figure 13.3 from your book, and it starts in our long-run equilibrium. We have our price level of 100, like always, and our real GDP is at that Y prime, that ideal number, and we're at full employment, so U is currently equal to U prime. Now, first click here, both long-run aggregate supply and short-run aggregate supply are jumping or shifting to the right because of this technology shock that occurred. And there's a new full employment output level that's Y prime prime. So we've had a jump in both long-run and short-run aggregate supply because of this technology shock. Now, what also happens here is that our equilibrium moves. So the point where all of these lines meet each other is going to move, and that's going to cause that price level to fall from 100 to 95. What's also going to happen here is that the unemployment rate is not going to change. It's still going to be at that natural rate, U is equal to U prime. So you can see here that we're just kind of mapping all of these curves with the ones next to them is where we started. And then we draw our new curve where shifts occurred because of the technology shock. And then we just find our new equilibrium and say, has the price level gone up or down? And what's happening here? So it's really not a difficult thing to do. It's just a matter of being able to break these graphs down, because again, if you just saw this all together, it does look a little crazy, but if you take it piece by piece, it starts to make a little more sense, I hope. So, is that the end of the story? Well, we're not really in long-run equilibrium any longer. Our unemployment rate is greater than U prime, and because the supply shock is temporary, eventually the short-run aggregate supply is going to shift back to the right again. So the price level, real GDP, and unemployment will all go back to their normal levels. And basically that just means that overall, even though these changes happen, it is likely that we will go towards that original kind of graph as we go on. Okay, so I'm going to skip this slide here because this is a different example that we're not going to do today. And I'm just going to kind of show you what an unexpected decline in just the short-run aggregate supply looks like graphically. So again, this is when something that only affects short-run aggregate supply is changing. This is figure 13.14 from your book, and it's going to start at long-run equilibrium, just like we did previously. And the first click, our short-run aggregate supply has jumped to the left because we had an unexpected oil shock. So this was something negative that occurred. Second click shows us where our new kind of equilibrium point falls. So it's point B right here. Price level has increased, inflation has occurred, and we're now at Y1 rather than at Y prime. Unemployment will be greater than that natural rate at this new point because we're not at that long run level, which means that we're having higher unemployment than what we would like. But eventually, that curve will go back to where it was to begin with. So this is like a pretty good example of what's happening right now with, oil prices just dropping like crazy. The short-run aggregate supply is going to decrease because less producers are going to want to be involved in that industry. But in the long run, it will go back to this original point A. It's just the short run that has an unexpected decline. So let's see. We're not going to look at this example right now. So I'm going to go ahead and skip this slide as well. This is just providing you with a couple more examples, but your book does walk you through these. So I'm going to go ahead and just make sure that we get through everything here. So practice what you know. Suppose that there's an increase in aggregate demand that causes a price level increase. What will happen in the long run as prices adjust? And this one's a little tricky too, so don't feel bad if you don't get this one right off the bat either. So you're very close. Eric, you were just a little bit backwards here. What will happen is that the price level will actually rise even further, and the reason being that over time, as prices adjust, the short-run aggregate supply will shift back to the left, and this is going to change the equilibrium between aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply once again to make it intersect with that long-run aggregate supply. So this leftward shift of that short-run aggregate supply is going to make the price level go up even further. So this one was really tricky because we talked about how a lot of times we try to get back to equilibrium whenever anything changes. But in this case, because that short run curve is moving, it is going to cause the price level to continue to rise. And this particular question is one of those questions that sort of feels like it was intentionally made to be tricky. So this is not something that you will see, outside of just the lecture itself. I'm not sure why they include this one in the slides because I think it does kind of throw students off a little bit. So I think I will take that one out. But typically the price level will try to adjust back to its original level. But in this particular example, it would end up eventually rising even further. So great try. That's all right. This one was a very difficult question. So recessions are unpredictable, and a variety of things can cause them. We've already covered that a lot of times throughout the semester. This particular aggregate demand and aggregate supply model is going to help us kind of understand the macroeconomic impacts of what's going on with real-world changes. We can also use this model to evaluate past recessions and maybe kind of analyze policy remedies to these events. So right now, when they're trying to come up with these packages, the stimulus packages, and kind of trying to decide what we should do, they're probably using a lot of aggregate demand and aggregate supply models to run a bunch of different kind of alternatives and see what the best outcome would be. Now, I really don't want you guys to get bogged down in the parts of this chapter that are a little more difficult. I'm really more concerned with the introductory level, just kind of equating this to regular supply and demand and making observations based on those different sort of theories that we talked about. So like the wealth effect, money illusion, interest rate effect, all of those different things. That's what I'm concerned with you understanding. And as you start to kind of work through your exam review and your inquisitives, I think that you'll see that as well. Now, just one more little reminder before we hop off today. I do drop one of your exams. So the final exam is not comprehensive, just to kind of reiterate that. Your final exam will only cover chapters 16, 17, and 18. Now, that being said, this week you have exam 3. This exam covers chapters 11, 12, 13, and 14. After you receive your grade for exam 3, if you're happy with where your overall grade is at, as long as you finish that last inquisitive for chapter 16 next week, you're done for the semester. You don't have to take the final because I do drop one of your lowest exam grades. Now, that also being said, the final is only over 3 chapters, but you still have just as much time as you did on your previous exams. So even if you're just not sure, you may just take the final exam to see where you land, and it's not going to hurt you if you do worse on that exam than you've done on previous exams. That'll just be your drop. So just something to consider. I have updated all grades, so participation and everything is currently up to date as of today, so even the stuff that was due last night. If you do have any questions about your grade, please send me an email sooner rather than later because we are kind of getting towards the end of the semester here. But other than that, if you don't have any questions, you're free to go. And thank you guys so much. I really cannot express enough how much I appreciate you guys and how proud I am of how well you guys are doing in this class. And don't forget, your participation discussion is also getting close to being due. So if you haven't done that, please go ahead and get that done here in the next couple of days. So thank you guys. Have a great week. I'll talk to you on Thursday.